In the year 1923, in Weimar, Germany, a single loaf of bread cost 200 billion Reichsmarks. Your entire life savings, if held in that currency, became utterly worthless, incapable of purchasing anything. The bank account that back in 1918 could have secured a comfortable home, by 1923 could barely afford sustenance. Just 5 years. That's all it took for a once stable currency to devolve into mere paper. Yet amidst this devastation, some individuals managed to endure. A select few even prospered. Their success wasn't due to foresight of the impending collapse, but rather by adhering to timeless principles that have proven effective during every such crisis, irrespective of its origin, the nation involved, or the era. Consider Argentina in 2001. The national currency, the peso, was frozen. Banks shuttered their doors, severing public access to their deposited funds. The government then proceeded to seize dollar accounts, forcibly converting them to pesos at an artificially manipulated exchange rate. Overnight, individuals saw 66% of their savings vanish. Yet here again, some people navigated the turmoil. They employed the very same fundamental principles that had guided survivors in Weimar, in Rome, and in every preceding economic breakdown. Now fast forward to America in the year 2025. The national debt has surged to $36 trillion. The currency has depreciated 98% of its purchasing power since 1913. In a mere 2-year span, the Federal Reserve injected $5 trillion into the economy. The current trajectory mirrors precisely the patterns that have historically heralded every currency collapse. And when that inevitable downturn arrives, whether it unfolds in 5 years or 15, the identical set of principles will dictate who emerges unscathed and who loses everything. This presentation will unveil the 5 financial tenets that have withstood every systemic collapse throughout recorded history. We will explore precisely why these principles remain effective when all else fails, present concrete historical examples that substantiate each principle and offer actionable guidance on how to implement them immediately before the opportunity passes. Understanding this is not about accumulating vast riches, it's about safeguarding what you possess. Because in every instance of economic collapse, the majority of people lose everything. This isn't due to a lack of intelligence, but rather because they cling to strategies that are effective in ordinary times, yet prove disastrous during periods of crisis. These 5 principles held true in ancient Rome. They were relevant in Weimar, and they will be relevant in America. Before delving into the 5 principles themselves, it is imperative to grasp why principles hold more significance than mere tactics. A tactic is a specific recommendation, such as acquire gold or divest from stocks. While these actions might yield positive results, their effectiveness hinges on timing, the unique nature of the collapse, and a myriad of variables. A principle, however, is a foundational truth that operates consistently, regardless of external factors. Principles were effective in Rome when gold served as the primary medium of exchange. They were applicable in Weimar when paper currency was dominant, and they will be effective in America, regardless of whether the collapse manifests as hyperinflation, deflation, or a complete currency reset. Most financial advice offered today is tactical. Recommendations like invest in this particular stock or allocate 60% to equities and 40% to bonds are predicated on the assumption that the existing financial system will continue to function seamlessly. They presuppose the solvency of banks, the adherence of governments to their contractual obligations, and the enforcement of property rights. During a collapse, every one of these assumptions crumbles. Yet the underlying principles endure. The foremost principle is that hard assets endure. Paper assets are ephemeral. They can be consumed by fire. When currencies disintegrate, governments default, and the financial infrastructure disintegrates, it is tangible assets that retain their value because they are intrinsically real. Paper-based assets, anything representing a claim on another entity, plummet to zero because the claim itself becomes unenforceable. In Weimar, Germany, between 1918 and 1923, possessing 100,000 Reichsmarks in a bank account in 1918 signified considerable wealth. By 1923, that same sum was insufficient to purchase even a single loaf of bread. The currency had been inflated into utter worthlessness, and paper fortunes evaporated into thin air. Conversely, individuals who owned tangible assets, land, structures, manufacturing facilities, survived. A farm that existed in 1918 remained a farm in 1923. It continued to produce food and retained its real-world value. Although the mark valuation of the farms escalated from 100,000 to 100 trillion, the farm itself remained unchanged. In Zimbabwe during the 2000s, hyperinflation reached an astronomical 79.6 billion% monthly by 2008. Any savings held in Zimbabwean dollars became worthless. However, those who possessed agricultural land, livestock, or machinery managed to preserve their wealth. Their land continued to yield crops irrespective of the currency's fate. In Argentina between 2000 and 2002, the government froze bank accounts and then mandated the conversion of dollar deposits into pesos at a rate of 1.4 pesos to the dollar. Subsequently, the peso depreciated further, reaching 4 pesos to the dollar. The same principle holds true across these disparate collapse scenarios. Hard assets endure, while paper assets are susceptible to destruction. In America, in the year 2025, a significant portion of wealth is held in paper-based assets, stocks, bonds, retirement funds, and bank deposits. Each of these represents a claim. A stock is a claim on corporate profits, a bond is a claim on repayment, and a bank deposit is a claim on a bank's promise. In stable economic conditions, these claims function as intended. However, during a collapse, the system breaks down. Courts become overburdened, banks fail, and governments default. Financial markets freeze, rendering paper claims devoid of value. Tangible assets, however, persist. Real estate remains real estate. Gold remains gold. A farm continues to produce sustenance. Such assets possess intrinsic worth, independent of the financial system. When the inevitable collapse occurs, paper assets will burn, but hard assets will endure. The second crucial principle dictates that one should possess productive assets, not speculative ones. This principle distinguishes between assets that generate ongoing value and those whose worth is solely predicated on the expectation that someone else will pay more for them later. Productive assets yield income, sustenance, or utility, independent of prevailing market sentiment. Speculative assets derive their value solely from the ability to resell them. During the Great Depression, spanning 1929 to 1933, the stock market experienced an 89% decline. Individuals who had invested in stocks for speculative purposes lost nearly everything. Conversely, those who directly owned productive assets such as farms, rental properties, or businesses continued to benefit from their output. A farm produced food that could be consumed or sold, and rental properties provided essential housing. Productive assets generate value independent of market fluctuations. A farm will continue to yield crops, whether the stock market is at its peak or at its nadir. Speculative assets, on the other hand, possess value only if a buyer can be found, and during a collapse, buyers become exceedingly scarce. In Venezuela during the 2010s, the stock market experienced a 100,000% increase in nominal terms. While this sounds impressive, it's crucial to recognize that the Venezuelan bolivar simultaneously lost 99.9% of its value. However, individuals who owned productive assets like farms, bakeries, or transportation services experienced relative prosperity. A bakery produced bread, a commodity desperately needed by the populace, thus generating tangible value. This stands in stark contrast to Venezuelan government bonds, whose value was entirely dependent on the government's commitment to honor them, a commitment that was ultimately abandoned, rendering the bonds worthless. In America, in the year 2025, the majority of assets are speculative. The S&P 500 derives its value from the collective belief in its future appreciation. Bitcoin produces nothing. Its value is sustained by the expectation that others will bid it up later. Most real estate is acquired for speculative purposes, with the intent to flip or benefit from appreciation. Productive assets are fundamentally different. A farm that cultivates food is productive, A rental property, owned outright, is productive. A business that manufactures goods essential to people's needs is productive. When a collapse occurs, prioritize ownership of assets that generate genuine value. A farm will sustain you, while speculation will not. The third principle is that debt is destructive. During a collapse, even debt incurred under favorable circumstances becomes a liability. In stable times, debt can serve as leverage. For instance, borrowing to purchase a home that subsequently appreciates can yield a profit. However, in a crisis, all debt transforms into detrimental debt. Your income may diminish or cease entirely, while your debt obligations remain constant. Lenders will still demand repayment. Failure to do so results in the forfeiture of the asset securing the debt. Consider the Great Depression. Farmers had borrowed to expand their operations during the 1920s, a period of rising land values where borrowing seemed prudent. Then the market crash of 1929 occurred. Crop prices plummeted, and farm incomes fell by 50 to 70%. However, the bank loans remained unchanged. Between 1930 and 1935, over 750,000 farms were foreclosed upon. Families who had owned land for generations lost everything due to their indebtedness. Compare this to farmers who owned their land outright, free of any encumbrances. They faced hardship as commodity prices were dire, but they survived. Without the burden of loan repayments, they subsisted on the produce of their farms. Debt-free farmers weathered the storm, while indebted farmers lost everything. In Argentina, in 2001, middle-class families held mortgages denominated in dollars. When the peso collapsed, their income in pesos dropped by 66%, yet their mortgage payments in dollars remained constant. Their income was reduced by 2/3, but their debt burden did not diminish. Consequently, they were unable to meet their obligations, and banks initiated foreclosures, causing individuals to lose homes they had been paying for over a decade or more. Meanwhile, homeowners who possessed their properties free and clear retained ownership. The crisis and the income reduction were identical, but the absence of debt prevented foreclosure. In Greece during the 2010s, incomes decreased by 30 to 40%, and pensions were reduced by 50%. Yet individuals with mortgages were still obligated to pay the same amounts. Default rates soared, and debt became their undoing. In America in the year 2025, households hold $17 trillion in debt, comprising $12 trillion in mortgages, $1.6 trillion in auto loans, $1.6 trillion in student loans, and $1 trillion in credit card debt. When the impending crisis arrives, this accumulated debt will devastate millions of families. A common counterargument is that inflation benefits debtors. If you owe $300,000 and inflation averages 20%, your debt diminishes in real terms. This assertion holds true only if your income keeps pace with inflation. However, during genuine collapses, incomes rarely do. The only secure position is to be completely debt-free, own assets outright. If you possess a house with an outstanding mortgage, you do not truly own the house. You own a leveraged gamble on continued rising property values and stable income. If you own your home outright, you possess a house, period. No bank can seize it. Debt represents leverage and expansion. In a collapse, it equates to self-destruction. The fourth principle asserts that skills represent the sole truly portable form of wealth. All other forms of wealth are vulnerable to confiscation. Land can be expropriated, gold can be seized, currency can be devalued through inflation, and businesses can be nationalized. Skills, however, reside within you. They are in your mind and cannot be taxed, confiscated, or eroded by inflation. During the Holocaust, Jewish families possessed property, businesses, and wealth, all of which were confiscated by the Nazis. Yet those Jews who survived often did so because of their skills. Doctors, engineers, artisans, and tailors, individuals possessing valuable skills, were able to work, trade their labor for sustenance, and rebuild in new environments. A wealthy merchant who owned property but lacked practical skills might face starvation, while a skilled craftsman who owned nothing but possessed the knowledge to build could survive and reconstruct. In the Soviet Union between 1917 and 1922, the Bolsheviks seized all private property. Aristocrats who once owned vast estates lost everything instantaneously. However, engineers, doctors, and skilled laborers retained their value. The Soviet state required their expertise, granting them leverage even under communist rule. An aristocrat owning 10,000 acres but unable to farm would likely perish, whereas a blacksmith owning nothing but capable of crafting tools would survive. In Vietnam in 1975, upon the fall of Saigon, millions fled the country. They were unable to take their property or businesses with them. The Vietnamese refugees who achieved the most successful resurgences in America were those possessing valuable skills: doctors, engineers, accountants, mechanics. They arrived with nothing but their expertise, and within a generation, they built prosperous lives. In America in the year 2025, the majority of wealth is concentrated in financial assets and real estate, neither of which is portable. If you are forced to relocate, you cannot take your house with you. Moreover, you might be prevented from taking currency if capital controls are implemented. Skills residing within your mind are the only guaranteed portable wealth. Unfortunately, a significant portion of the American population lacks practical, transferable skills. Can you cultivate food, repair machinery, construct shelter, or provide medical care? These are invaluable skills in any economy, whether stable or in collapse. Cultivate skills that generate value, independent of complex systems. Skills form the bedrock of reconstructible wealth. Everything else is ultimately vulnerable to seizure. The fifth and final principle states that local trust networks endure longer than any institution. When systems falter, institutions collapse, banks close, governmental authority erodes, and law enforcement becomes ineffective, the entire institutional framework disintegrates. However, localized networks of trusted relationships persist. The Soviet Union dissolved in 1991, followed by another economic crisis in 1998. The government ceased to function, the currency became worthless, pensions were halted, and supply chains fractured, leaving grocery stores bare. Russians survived through the strength of their local networks. Families pooled their resources, neighbors engaged in mutual exchange, and communities organized for security and shared necessities. The individuals who fared best were not necessarily the wealthiest, but rather those deeply integrated into robust local networks. Isolated individuals possessing ample bank funds often faced destitution, while those connected through relationships thrived. In Argentina, in 2001, as banks closed, neighborhood assemblies emerged. Communities organized at a local level for bartering, resource sharing, and mutual protection. These informal networks superseded governmental authority. Individuals embedded within these networks could exchange skills for food or labor for goods. In Lebanon, from 2019 to the present, the national currency lost 90% of its value. Banks shut down, and the government became largely ineffectual. Yet Lebanon has not descended into complete chaos. The reason lies in its organizational structure, which is deeply rooted in family and religious community networks. These networks provide essential services that the government cannot. Prior to the advent of modern institutions, all economic activity transpired through networks of trust. Transactions occurred with individuals known personally, and loans were extended based on the certainty of repayment. Modern institutions enable large-scale operations beyond local trust. However, when these institutions fail, a reversion to trust-based networks is inevitable. In America in the year 2025, most individuals are institutionally integrated but locally isolated. You may have a bank account but remain unfamiliar with your neighbors. You rely on large retailers for sustenance but may not know local farmers. You depend on law enforcement but lack close ties within your immediate community. This represents a state of catastrophic fragility. When institutions crumble, there is no safety net. Cultivate local networks now. Become acquainted with your neighbors. Foster reciprocal relationships. Integrate yourself into a community. As institutional trust erodes, local trust becomes increasingly vital. Individuals with strong local networks will survive. Isolated individuals will face significant challenges. These are the 5 foundational principles. Tangible assets endure. Paper assets are susceptible to destruction. Prioritize productive assets over speculative ones. Debt is a destructive force during collapse. Skills represent portable wealth. Local trust networks outlast institutional frameworks. Notice what is conspicuously absent from this list: specific stock recommendations, preferred cryptocurrencies, or a definitive choice between gold and silver. These are tactical considerations. The principles, however, remain universally applicable, regardless of the specific circumstances. They were effective in Rome. They were effective in Weimar. They will be effective in America. The inherent advantage of principles is that they do not necessitate perfect timing. You are not required to pinpoint the exact moment of collapse. Instead, you position yourself according to principles that demonstrably survive such events. By holding hard assets instead of paper, you preserve wealth whether the collapse occurs in 2030 or 2040. Hard assets maintain their value during both stable periods and crises. Owning productive assets ensures income generation if the system remains stable and provides tangible output if it collapses. Eliminating debt builds resilience during normal times and ensures survival during a crisis, whereas indebted individuals may lose everything. Developing skills enhances income in stable economies and becomes your sole portable asset during a collapse. Building local networks fosters community during stable times and provides essential survival infrastructure during a crisis. These principles enhance your life in the present and offer protection for the future. The common mistake individuals make is waiting for absolute certainty. They desire precise knowledge of when a collapse will occur. However, collapses rarely announce themselves in advance. By the time the event is unequivocally obvious, it is invariably too late. The brilliance of adhering to principles lies in its independence from predictive capabilities. By positioning yourself based on what has historically survived collapses, you are safeguarded irrespective of precise timing. These 5 principles are ancient, having endured for over 3,000 years because they are fundamentally true across all economic systems: the Roman Empire, medieval Europe, the Industrial Revolution, and modern America. The principles remain constant because human nature and the laws of mathematics do not change. When debt surpasses the capacity for repayment, collapse is inevitable. When currency is debased, paper wealth evaporates. When institutions fail, local networks become paramount. These are not mere predictions. They are observable patterns that have repeated hundreds of times throughout history. The impending collapse in America will follow these same established patterns. The specific tactics that prove effective this time will be tailored to our present circumstances. However, the underlying principles will remain constant. Tangible assets endure. Productive assets generate value. Debt is destructive. Skills are portable, and local networks outlast institutions. Align your position with these principles now, and you will survive what is coming. Disregard them and pursue tactics, and you are essentially gambling on your ability to perfectly time the collapse, a bet that most individuals lose. If this discourse has illuminated the superior importance of principles over tactics, demonstrated that the same 5 principles have survived every historical collapse, and shown that you can position yourself for security without needing to predict the exact timing, then consider subscribing. The subsequent video will delve into the specific tactics that align with these principles for 2025 America. We will explore which hard assets are sensible in a digital economy, which productive assets generate value in contemporary markets, strategies for systematically eliminating debt, the most valuable skills to acquire, and methods for building local networks within an increasingly isolated society. The principles articulate what to do. The tactics explain how to do it. These 5 principles have been tested and proven in Rome, in Weimar, in Argentina, and in every subsequent crisis. They will prove effective in America. The sole question remaining is whether you will embrace them before the opportunity wanes, or whether you will later regret not having done so.